Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Alan Levine, and together with Tom Merrill, my colleague in the Department of Government at American University, I run the Political Theory Institute, the host of this evening's conversation. I'd just like to quickly mention we have 3 other public events this semester. On February 23rd, we have Teresa Bejan of Oxford University talking about tolerance and mere civility. On April 20th, we have David Bromwich of Yale University on Disorder and Doctrine in America, some hints from Burke and Lincoln. Those 2 will be Zoom conversations like this one with me. And we have one live at AU in-person event, and that is March 30th with Matt Continenti of the American Enterprise Institute, and who's also teaching at AU this semester. All of those events, as tonight's, will be recorded and available for later viewing. Tonight's topic is racial reconciliation. What can the United States learn from South Africa? And it might seem outside the purview of a political theory institute, but it's actually a perfect topic for us because we're very interested in the intersection of ideas and reality. It's why we philosophize out of a government department, and why we've hosted speakers in the past such as H.R. McMaster, and debates and talks on the morality and future of capitalism, immigration, U.S. foreign policy, and race. And to guide us in our topic tonight, we're very lucky to have Eve Fairbanks. Eve is an award-winning journalist who writes about change in cities, countries, landscapes, morals, values, and our ideas of ourselves. A former political writer for the New Republic, her essays and reportage have been published in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Guardian, among other outlets. Born in Washington, D.C. and raised in Virginia, she's lived in Johannesburg, South Africa for 13 years. Her reporting has been funded by the Fulbright Program, the Institute of Current World Affairs, the Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative, the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and the Writing Invisibility Project at the Max Planck Institute. The Inheritors, which is this handsome volume, The Inheritors is her 2022 book on post-apartheid South Africa, on which today's conversation will be based. And it was longlisted in January for a PEN America's John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. So Eve, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start with the book's title, The Inheritors, right? So we're all inheritors of a preformed world, right? Nobody totally creates the world around them. We're all conversely shaped by our world. I guess the question is, right, can the world be more, or can we change the world? Or are we simply victims of the world into which we're born? And your book is a look at a particularly tragic inherited situation in South Africa, for which a lot of people over the years have had very simple solutions. If we just do X, Y, or Z, we can solve all the problems there. And your book suggests that it's actually very complex, and that the legacies that South Africans have inherited live on despite people's wishes, hopes, and even understandings. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of inheritance and how that works out in the book, what you try to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, South Africa, I think in the post-apartheid era has a kind of paradox to it, which is the more there were attempts to act as if it's a kind of a tabula rasa, as if we're not affected by both even the physical ways that people still move through the society, the ways that institutions exist, the institutions of the state, a lot of which have shapes and capacities that pre-existed the current point. The more that was sort of, it was pretended that it was this kind of whole new world, this new situation, which oddly I think was like exacerbated by the fact that South Africa ended apartheid and became a full democracy in 1994. There was slightly kind of millenarian, kind of the new millennium, Mandela, you know, this, it's a new country. There's a very famous book on South Africa right after apartheid called Tomorrow, Another Country. And the more people thought of it in that way and acted in that way, the more the remainders of the past, and I explore in the book both kind of I don't know, state capacities, institutions that are still have capacities and designs that are holdovers from apartheid, and kind of mores and norms that continue to exist, forms of assumptions about who's competent, who deserves what type of service by the government, et cetera. The more that was ignored, the more it kind of continued to bedevil the society. And I'll give just one example. It was, so right when apartheid ended, as the last white government was leaving, they commissioned a factory in Johannesburg to burn in a kind of Holocaust a lot of the records of what had happened. And this was not very well known. You know, when the new government came in, it didn't want to focus on retribution, on kind of old resentments. It really wanted to move forward. It didn't dwell on that. But some of the things that were destroyed, the records that were destroyed, were financial records and records of corruption in that last white government. It was a very corrupt last regime. And there's a historian who's done a lot of work to kind of like put some of that back together and resurface the history and the reality that the state that the majority, the Black South Africans inherited and got, was kind of presented to them and to the world as it had been run as by an unjust regime, but it was very developed, the most westernized, most developed country in Africa, great roads, water, kind of like an operationally efficient, functional state. And that wasn't the truth. It was very, very near bankrupt and run through with corruption in the bureaucracy. And the fact that that wasn't really understood, and I go in the book into almost psychological reasons why people tried to kind of deny that and ignore that fact. But it meant that Black South African leaders, when they took over, became, they dealt with things, they had problems that they didn't expect. They also developed a reputation very, very quickly, before it was really deserved, in my opinion, for having messed up something that was very nice, which then bred among some a lot of resentment and a further kind of denials of the real problems, a turning toward kind of identity politics and a whole lot of problems that might not have been forestalled if there had been more openness about kind of the reality of what everyone was bringing with them, but I think they wouldn't have been as bad. So I try to explore things like that in this book. This kind of, you know, when we think of, we have these moments in the US, I think of like Obama's presidency, which was, I was covering for the New Republic, and there was a kind of a feeling of a new beginning. We love that feeling, that type of feeling of that moment, a new dawn. And something addictive about that idea that I think can end up being kind of a poison chalice as a concept.
Yeah, one of the things that I really like about the book is how psychologically astute it is, and the way that it gets at that is, instead of sort of simply being a historical narrative, though you weave plenty of history and plenty of politics throughout, you really focus on a handful of individuals and that we get to know, and we see them wrestling with phenomena and sort of contradictions within their souls, unhappiness within themselves, their hopes and aspirations and failures, which you then kind of contextualize and spread out with other examples, and right, but it really enables you to delve into the psychological bases of what's going on. And so I guess my question is, how did you choose the people that you chose? And I think most of us know, the basics of South African history of apartheid, but maybe do you want to just give us a little background on apartheid and tell us why you chose the people you chose to get at the story?
Yeah. Well, I'll say first, I mean, the reason that I chose to write in the book, it starts around the 1970s, and it follows primarily three, but some other individuals who one of them was a soldier, one of the last white men drafted to fight for the apartheid regime. Another was an activist, a young Black activist in a then segregated neighborhood. So she was politically active. And then her daughter, who's part of a generation in South Africa called the Born Frees. So these are people who, it's part of that idea kind of you were talking about, the inheritance or not, the sort of hope was that this would be a generation that is not, doesn't remember the past, doesn't have these burdensome and restricting memories. And, I started writing, I was a political philosophy student in college, and then I became a journalist. Yes, yeah. And then I wanted to take that to the present day, and I went to DC to write about politics. And I very quickly found that the way one was expected to write about it very much dealt with principles, so to speak. Top level actors, I was covering Congress, so I was doing Harry Reid, and it started to feel to me that in this almost very basic way that I read much and wrote so little about the majority of people who are political actors in American society, which are just people. You can make a lot of arguments that they don't really have influence compared to a whole lot of types of elites, but in some essential way, they are the political actors. And I wanted to write about how people experience a kind of very dramatic political transformation, and not only a very stark change, but in the case of South Africa, the collapse of something that until it collapsed was considered an ideal. So the people who ran the apartheid state believed that it was an ideal form of government. They believed that it sort of, manifested human ideals. They thought it was a kind of glorious thing. At least some of them did. And then suddenly the whole country experienced a kind of moral reversal, and that ideal was discredited. South Africa was a colonial society that bore a lot of resemblance to Kenya, to Northern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, that kind of took a little bit of a turn in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when various Afrikaner groups, these were people who had come mainly from Holland, but from other parts of Europe, mostly as laborers. They were kind of low-level sort of subjects in Europe, and they were shipped to run farms in this colony at the tip of Southern Africa. And they got fired up by the example of America in part, and they formed republics with constitutions modeled on the American Constitution. They believed that they were kind of torchbearers of liberty, that they had Republican principles. They had these republics. A lot of conflict with the British Empire ended up creating South Africa, which was in the British Empire until the 1950s, actually 1960, when it really broke away and became its own country. And at that point, a color bar, as it was called in other countries, in other sub-Saharan colonies, began to be much more kind of explicitly enforced. And that was because the Afrikaners, kind of like the Americans in some ways, had conceptualized themselves as a new people, as a different people, a people of Africa. It just means Africans in Dutch and then Afrikaans. And they did not have a colony to return to. And they felt that once they split off from the British Empire, that they were already a minority of the population, that I mean, there were a lot of racist ideas there, but they also needed to hang on to their power through a rather extreme form of segregation. And there were a lot of laws that dispossessed Black South Africans of land, that restricted some types of voting. But apartheid was explicitly inspired by Jim Crow. They sent emissaries to Alabama to study the Black and white colleges, the Black and white fountains and beaches. You did not get that in other African colonies, that white beach, Black beach, quite that thing. So it became a very extreme segregationist state where Black South Africans really could barely attend universities. There was a prominent Black university where Mandela studied, but not really. They could barely own any kinds of businesses. You could not even, if you take American states, if you were Black, you could not pass through a state or a province that had been designated for Indian people or for white or for colored people or whatever. You couldn't stay for more than 48 hours. This was all policed very intensively. And even up to 1987, you couldn't marry or even you couldn't have sex with someone of another race. This was policed heavily. It was a police state, segregationist police state. And then extremely rapidly, it became a democracy, sort of dedicated to serving all of its people. And to me, this was just such an iconic and such an unusual and fascinating and important and really rare type of event, because unlike in other African colonies, millions of white South Africans stayed on to become subjects and equal citizens of this state that they had owned and that they had run. And that was just a very, very unusual situation. And I thought about writing about it in a lot of different ways. I initially thought, okay, what are archetypes? Interesting types of figures. There is a story in the book of a Black farmer, because agriculture was, there was a kind of, we're destined, we've been chosen by God to turn Southern Africa into a Garden of Eden kind of thing, part of the ideology of the apartheid state. And they were very proud of their commercial agriculture, their farming. And I wanted to see how a Black South African would be able to enter that type of a role. So I sort of pursued that.
So you've been talking about some of the distinctive aspects of South Africa, but yet you also write in some places about similarities between South Africa and the United States. And so you write towards the end that in you're studying South Africa, it's like you see America in a funhouse mirror. that I could see its emergent features more clearly, right? And so are you like a kind of Tocqueville came to the United States to see what was going to happen in Europe by studying South Africa? Are you thinking you're seeing what's happening in America more clearly?
I wouldn't want to sort of hubristically say that, but I think so.
Okay, all
I
right.
remember thinking,
A little
you know,
hubris is good.
I was I was here. I was in South Africa during the Trump campaign in 2016, and I don't the whole thing was kind of shocking, but at the time, but I was told by friends of mine here, they said, you really predicted that. You said he can win, he's going to win. And I remember thinking, I think I thought that because of what I've seen here in South Africa. And so to some degree, yes. And I would just say two things that really came to the fore for me. And I ended up writing about the people that I found that I just wanted to talk about the most, that I told friends about the most, that whose life stories and character and the way they talked about the country was so illuminating to me. That's those three people. But, firstly, South Africans have gone through and grappled a lot with something that I think Americans, to some extent, have yet to really start to consider, which is when you have a more substantial demographic shift and you have a situation where disproportionately on op-ed pages, in Congress, at universities, people, the leadership of academic departments, when those are, or police forces, let's take that as an example, when the leadership of that starts to be dominated by people of color. These are institutions from which people felt excluded. They sometimes, generated ideas and cultures that were insulting, exclusionary. How are these people going to use those institutions? How are they going to work in them? How are they going to use them? And certainly here, I think the country has recognized that the temptation to use institutions and to wield power in totalizing or harsh or brutal ways that you criticized conceptually when you were out of power becomes very, very intense when you're in power for a whole lot of reasons. I sometimes don't think in the US we fully think about the fact that that people who are out of power will change when they gain power. They won't have the same goals. They won't be the same people. And I thought of this recently with, I read some things expressing just real surprise that the police who beat Nichols in Memphis were Black, and that would not surprise South Africans at all. The other thing that I found so interesting in South Africa was how hard it was for white South Africans to accept that they were forgiven, and to accept sort of grace and just being kind of incorporated as ordinary people into a society. I think there's a line in the book, which is a phenomenon I saw over and over, that white South Africans couldn't forgive Black South Africans for forgiving them. By which I mean, they almost wanted, I think, there was a part of them that really did want Black South Africans to act very badly toward them and to be harsh, to reverse racism them and to victimize them, because it would make what they did, what their state did when they were in power, seem more inevitable. That's just what people do when they're in power. It's human. if Black South Africans do not treat them as they treated Black South Africans, it makes them seem more exceptional in a bad way. And it raises more questions about that. It wasn't necessary to behave that way. Why did you?
And it leads to a lot of shame. The idea of
Yeah.
shame comes up repeatedly throughout your book.
Yes. Yeah. A lot. Something that I find in the United States is a lot of writing and reporting, especially among journalists, that comes from brief interviews or surveys or polls. And in South Africa, one of the reasons I spent years with specific people was so that they could reveal kind of the layers of their beliefs and things that they wouldn't tell a pollster, that they hadn't even quite yet articulated to themselves until we started talking about it at a lot of length. And I talked about, my experience in the United States and whatever. And I think we underrate shame and guilt as psychological forces in American politics, because not that many people, of any kind will tell a pollster very easily things that they really feel guilty about and kind of ashamed of, about how they behaved when they were young, or even thinking about their parents, or because the nature of shame is that you want to hide it if it's real. I mean, you can easily cop to something that is not what you really feel ashamed of.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of shame on the Black South African side, because they feel like the post-apartheid period for them was a kind of trial, like they got liberated just to be on trial. And the trial was, were the whites right in their adjudication that Black people aren't really competent and capable enough? This was a real fear and a real anxiety, and problems and missteps become a huge source of shame that maybe this is true, which is also something that you have to get into it to start to hear.
Yeah. I want to say to the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we're going to talk for a little while longer and then take your questions. So please do that. I thought, Eve, that it might be useful to sort of go through first sort of the Afrikaner experience and then the Black South African experience. You noted, I didn't know this, that the Afrikaners set up some of the first republics after the American Revolution, explicitly modeled off of the American Revolution, but then they lost a war to the British and were put in concentration camps. And after that, they kind of replicated that concentration camp experience on the Black South Africans once they got into power. But when they were in power, and one of the early things is that a lot of the white South Africans said they didn't know. They didn't know what the government was doing, how bad things were. You talk about, precisely because of apartheid, there were a lot of white people didn't see Black people hardly at all, except as maids. But what do you make of that ignorance of the reality in their country during that time? And I don't know, how would you compare that to the experience of white people in the United States?
It's a funny question, because on the one hand, I think, someone who grew up in the 1990s in South Africa would have been a white South African would have been much more likely to interact with Black people than maybe a suburban white kid in a very white neighborhood in a kind of very white dominated school, because it was such an unequal society, and you have the help. Most white South African families will have a Black maid that comes still once a week or more, a black garden. They used to call them garden boys, like a gardener. That was the society. So, and yet I believed it when a friend of mine told me, so he grew up in a rural area, a farming town. And he said, I'm telling you, it sounds so stupid, but I really believed. He was born in around 1965. So it would have been the late 1970s. I really believed that South Africa was like 85% white. I thought that was the demographics. Maybe once in school, somebody told, but that was what I believed because, and I can see that because the apartheid state, it almost instantiated things in the US that are a little more kind of not done so explicitly. It sculpted the landscape. So it removed Black people from where they were living and put them in depressions, in valleys, so that they couldn't be seen in the landscape. So that was real. However, there are people who, there was a small set of white writers and musicians who spoke out very, very strongly against apartheid. They were able to understand, at least conceptually, the injustice of it. And they would have said at the time, you just aren't looking, you could be more curious. And I do think that South Africa had a very strong, it sounds strange to say, but kind of idealistic streak. It was always talked in speeches and stuff. They were very they would be recognizable to some Americans for their kind of idealism, ideals, what the country stands for, what ideals we hope to live up to. And that sense of being an idealistic society was very important to them. And if you troubled that as an ordinary white person, that kind of vision of yourself as embodying in this strange life on this Black continent, some type of ideal, you would, I think people didn't want to trouble that.
Yeah. So how would you compare that sort of the pair of the idealism and blindness to unpleasant realities in South Africa to the idealism and blindness to unpleasant realities among whites in the US? Is it similar? What are the similarities and differences?
My personal feeling, and I feel that this is going to disappoint, political philosophy lovers and idealists among us, but I started to feel when I got into South Africa, reading South African history and seeing the country now, that there was an inverse correlation between how actually arbitrary and self-serving and somewhat unjust the country's actual form of government was, and its claim to idealism. In other words, there would be the more absurdist apartheid became. So it became basically, I think whites felt that it was necessary to hold on to power. And then they started to generate a whole kind of science around it and set of kind of values and stuff whereby they had to differentiate mixed race or so-called colored South Africans from Black and white South Africans. And then they had to figure out Chinese people who came and visited. Are they colored or are they white? Right. They made Japanese people, they call them honorary whites because they wanted their electronics. It all became very absurd. but the more it became kind of self-serving, and I think the more some of the leaders really knew deep down that this was an unworkable society. This was really unjust, especially as the 20th century unfolded and there were these fights for justice, civil rights struggle in the United States, Second World War, the end of the Holocaust, the struggles in Eastern Europe in the 1980s to bring down the Berlin Wall, that this was not a just situation. The more strenuously they appealed in their rhetoric to ideals. And, you know, sometimes when I come back to the US, I think of that. I think of, I don't know, people who talk in abstract ways about the greatness of a national soul, about, you find it on the left, though, too, a kind of idealism about what America stands for, what its potential is, what it can accomplish, and sometimes I feel that rhetoric becomes more impassioned the less is actually being done to resolve in any practical way real inequities that are just totally visible to people.
Yeah. Okay. So after apartheid ends, you explore some of the difficulties for the white Afrikaners, right? And you talk about how they're not supposed to cling to the past, yet they're not fully welcome to the future either, right? That you know, and you describe the white Afrikaners as living in a very small space because they don't want to justify the past, but they feel like they have to hide themselves and they can't speak up when they have something to say. And so even if they see something that's wrong, well, it's not their place as a white person to say it. And so there's a kind of forced silence on them. And that at least some of the people in your book, you know, so, I mean, that kind of goes two ways. Some of them are really craving connections to Black people, and some of them end up saying, well, if I can't say anything, if I'm going to, you know, then if you're not going to include me, then fine, I'm just going to sort of go back to the old ways and embrace the old ways.
Yeah. I mean, I do think,
like,
not
what's
fully,
the best way to handle that, right?
not fully welcomed into the future. Yeah, I mean, for people who aren't that familiar with South Africa, you do get a phenomenon here whereby, you know, there are white South Africans who really want to be allies and who are really trying to speak the right language and join, you know, march in protests for Black lives and I think they sometimes expect a welcome that they don't get, and sometimes, and you know, they can there's a feeling sometimes here among Black South Africans, I think, that they want to feel a sense of possession, a possession of moral authority, of the kind of moral space, the right to finally to kind of dictate what's right and wrong. And they don't really want like white people kind of in the meeting where this is hashed out. They feel sometimes that, you know, you guys were repressing us for generations, and now you just want to come and like wave a sign with us, you know, get out of here. And I could see, and I saw how it could be hard for white South Africans where they really do want to participate in new ways. They want to, you know, be curious. They want to change the way they interact with the society. They want to give to charity, whatever, and they just aren't welcomed. And you got a phenomenon whereby people literally retreat into secure, it's called semigration here, which is a play on emigration, semi-emigrate. And so they semigrate behind into these sort of security estates, which almost all white, a lot of them, and gated, and they'll sometimes have a school and a hospital, and they're like these little mini countries where people go into. And there's also like a strange thing where there's a lot of people who stop being political actors. They just say, we're not involved in politics anymore. Don't have any interaction with it. Don't talk about it. Don't trust the government. And this causes really odd effects. I mean, I think that it's not my place to say, but I heard people say that Black South Africans, unfortunately, there's this hesitation on the part of anybody to say, hey, Black South Africans, you have to be careful to do X. You have to really work to win the trust. You have to work on being friendly to white South Africans, because the feeling can be like, are you kidding? I don't, I don't want to have to work at this anymore. But I do think
in the US,
yeah, there needs to be a positive approach to these attempts. They're not always going to come off right, but they need to be encouraged.
But it seems to me that sometimes in the US on race sensitive matters, white people don't speak up because it's risky, and they will not be accepted or shouted down. And it requires Black people to say those same things and in order for the point to be made. Does that phenomena exist in South Africa too? Yeah.
And sometimes it's, we have a idea in the US around cancel culture that mainly you would not speak up because you're afraid of social ramifications, reputational. I think also I see here a real sincere feeling like, maybe it's not my moment. Maybe maybe I should sit back and listen. That can be sincere. However, what I've also noticed here, and I don't know if you think this exists in the US, is that actually when people don't say, when they feel they can't say something that they observe publicly. So the example here might be sexual assault. South Africa has a really big problem with sexual assault, and there are some social pathologies that are particular to white communities, and this one it's very bad in townships. And white people feel they can't say that South Africa has a rape problem because it's tantamount to saying, like, I don't know, Black people, can't control this situation. So the less, though, that they can partake in a public debate and say that, the more I find that they start to ruminate and think it more and ruminate over it in private, and those feelings in private conversations amongst each other and internally become amplified, and they start to feel, God, this country really is a piece of crap. Like, these people just can't manage it. And it creates this, it can actually make people more racist who weren't to begin with, this hiding.
So that's maybe an important lesson from the US, from South Africa for the US, to keep open conversation, honest, frank conversation, and not shout it down. One other question about whites in South Africa: the progressive white community seems to come off looking pretty bad in your book. And during the apartheid time, as you mentioned, they were beacons. They were one of the few who had the eyes to see, right? When other white people were blind, they could see the injustice going on. But since the end of apartheid, there's been a lot of weird phenomena within the progressive community in South Africa. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a kind of anti-woke, like figures in the US. Well, Elon Musk is South African, but people who kind of seem to have been more liberal. He's not a great example, but who kind of start to be veering toward the right. that I noticed right when I got to South Africa that some of very big names who had even been imprisoned by the apartheid government, white South Africans, for assisting the cause of Black liberation. One of them, after I arrived, had wrote this big cover essay for a big magazine, suggesting that it had kind of all been a mistake, and whites in Cape Town should probably try to break away from South Africa and reform like a white-run state. And this was startling to me. So I talked to a lot of these people. I mean, I think they had the sense of themselves under apartheid as actually at a vanguard. They were literally progressive. They had the right idea and they suffered for it. And we want some benefit, in all kinds of ways from things we've really suffered for. They were outcasts. I mean, they were shunned by their communities, often under apartheid. And they expected in the aftermath, I think, to retain a kind of position as leaders in thinking about, where the country goes next, and that they would be sought after by Black politicians who had allied with them under apartheid to help write policy papers, and that they would be writing, op-eds and books that were like really beloved. And they had a sudden decline in their importance once the Black majority could speak and was free, and the situation started to change. And this came, I mean, it's hard to express the degree of kind of change in position and shock to which this came. It sounds strange, but it really came as the downgrading of their importance, and just that they were being ignored. And I think some of them really sought out positions that would once again be controversial.
Right. And so you talk about them now as sort of like, like talking super morally while underpaying their gardeners, but also exaggerating Black crime and the dangers of white supremacy to make themselves look better without having to do any hard work.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's kind of two categories. There's sort of like well-meaning lefty white South Africans who are often perceived by Black South Africans, and I think not unjustly, as having a very superficial commitment to some of the ideals that they profess. And this is, limousine liberal. It's kind of like a limousine liberal idea, but it's sort of more obvious in South Africa because your opportunities are just clearer. People interact with their maids and whatever, and you have many opportunities to change the way that you pay people and you relate, and so there's a kind of, there are also, I would say, more progressive and lefty white South Africans who do something else, which is to focus obsessively on certain white figures who are super, super right-wing, like, I don't know, like an Andrew Tate type of person, these kind of extremists. There are still white nationalists who are like overt, proud white supremacists, and they will say, I believe that the white race is superior. There still are people like that in South Africa. And you have progressive white South Africans who lament this and the danger of it. But it's somehow quite clear in South Africa that, to me, that sometimes they overrate these people's influence, these hard right people, and their danger, and the danger of an upswing of fascist whites, because it kind of makes the way that they live, which is pretty much still not having really engaged with how they might change, but not, they're not going around waving a Confederate flag or the old apartheid flag, which people do wave Confederate flags in South Africa. And so at least, they're still good. They're not like that. And I really see that, honestly. I mean, people may disagree with me, but I feel sometimes the threat of the white right in the US, the hard right, is really overstated as a way of comforting people who aren't part of it, you know, by resisting it, and pointing it out, you know, we will feel like we're resisting something really dangerous when a lot of real change is a lot more quotidian, honestly.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to turn to the Black South African experience now. And over the course of your book, it seems to me there's a lot more growth there. But of course, it starts from a lot worse place, with especially internalized feelings of Black self-doubt, which you trace throughout. I mean, even until today. And that often when something goes bad for somebody, for one of your Black people, something goes bad, it's just like an ordinary thing, but it leads them to the thought of, oh, maybe they were right, that Black people are inferior. Can you talk a little bit about that self-doubt, and if you have thoughts to get rid of it?
This is huge. And I think it was something that was exposed after the end of apartheid, because under apartheid, the voices who were saying, quite literally, Black people are not capable of running a modernized country like this. They can't run an economy. Those were white leaders were saying that. So you could sort of say that's where it's coming from. Now, after whites lost power, gave up power, I think people started to realize that that voice was still ringing inside of them. Yeah. It wasn't being said to them anymore, necessarily. You know, there's a whole story in my book about a Black farmer whose farm his project, he encounters a lot of problems, and he's working with a government official who's quite well educated. Both of them are real wonderful people, quite aspirational. And due to various sort of legacies of this agricultural system, they encounter a lot of problems, and they go very quickly to blaming each other / blaming Black people quite overtly in ways that startled me a little bit when I first started to hear it. Like, I guess, you know, it turns out Black people, you know, literally a high-level government official said in one speech that he was afraid that it was turning out that Black people just can't farm, which sounds to us like a strange statement, but this was like a parent having said this all the time. This was said so constantly. And, you know, one of the issues that it causes is a difficulty in analyzing what are the real problems that are confronting government and society, because it keeps coming up. Maybe it's just us, like maybe you just can't do it. And
so what can be done about that?
I think in a way that's the work of time. I suppose that I wanted to illuminate it in my book because I read some things about South Africa that I felt did not reveal how often people say that type of thing, maybe because it's painful or awkward to write about it, talk about it. And because it's the truth, it's what's happened here. And because I think the United States is still facing, you know, situations are still coming where you will have, you know, many more people in a cabinet that are people of color, or many more, you know, people running in academic departments, and that may, you know, there may start to be these types of doubts that are experienced in fresh ways that we haven't really thought of yet. So I think it's interesting to look to South Africa. I think I do think that time will start to resolve that. The young woman that I wrote about has a little more distance from that. She still kind of has questions about that linger, but she has more distance. I think you're kind of, it's odd. I mean, you're looking to hold on for long enough to this very unworkable, unmanageable government and society so that it's not in a totally bad place for new generations to inherit it and then, be a little less constricted by these feelings.
So the kind of the opposite problem also exists among Black people in South Africa with, self-doubt on the one hand, but also excessive expectations, I think, on the other, right? And so when they got power, people thought things were going to change overnight, right? You talk about a kind of magical thinking and describe someone as like, as if it was going to be the Princeton economics department and Bob Marley, some combination of that in government. And it was going to be like super efficient and problems get solved and in a really cool, fun, hipster way at the same time. And of course, that doesn't happen. It can't happen because this is the real world and problems take a long time to work out. And I don't know. I mean, I guess that's a problem of inexperience. Or to what do you attribute?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't put it that. I mean, I would. So one of the things I try to do when I write is, if someone says something that seems sort of stupid, which of course people are talking about politics in ways that we find stupid all the time. I'm sure. I wonder how could that's so stupid. I really try to figure out why that person has said that. And one of these mid-level bureaucrats, Black South Africans that I spent a lot of time with, eventually at a certain point, he said to me, I'm going to tell you something that sounds stupid, but I'm telling you, it's what we really, really deep down, I think, believed. We thought that we were getting the white country. We looked at what white South Africans had. We looked at their neighborhoods. We looked at their, that looked really well-resourced and sparkling. We thought we were getting the white country. We weren't. We were getting the whole country, including all the problems that we already had. And, in South Africa, that meant 85% of what you were getting was what you already found incredibly problematic and bad. And I do think, and he said, even people with PhDs coming back from exile looked at the white country and thought, this is what we're coming into. This is what we're inheriting and what this is the state we're going to run. And I think those expectations were pervasive and it was a hope. I mean, after you've been effectively imprisoned, which this type of segregation was a form of sort of open air imprisonment for decades and decades and decades, you would like to go be liberated into a nice place. Like, find it very understandable that there was a great expectation that Black South Africans would pretty rapidly start to have types of lives that they'd seen whites leading, and that the economy just didn't support that.
Okay, I want to go to, I have some other questions and thoughts, but I want to go to some of our audience questions now. One of them comes from an AU alum, Kathy Chamberlain, and she asks, did the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission help the transition in South African society at all, or was what was unearthed quickly forgotten?
Yeah, so the important thing to know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think this is true of a lot of these types of important initiatives and risky type of changes, is that there's no counterfactual. And it's really, really, really hard to analyze what it did and didn't do, because you can't compare it to, let's say, South Africa had a Nuremberg type of a process, or it hadn't done anything. We don't know what race relations would be like. We don't know what the government would have done or been able to do. We don't know what what would have been done. I do think some of the analysis of the TRC kind of had the underlying premise that the main problem in South Africa was like antipathy remaining between people and between race groups, when the problems were really the big, huge problems that were going to loom over the country were structural and related to institutions. So probably it's solved less than certain, especially overseas kind of people maybe kind of fantasized that it would. That said, I think people here do feel that the truth part, the airing of truth, was really important, particularly because the apartheid state was very secretive and tried to burn a lot of its records and stuff.
Okay, we also have a couple of questions about shame. And one is from our friend Ken Masugi, and he writes that he can understand that such a passion could arise from religious influence, in particular Christianity with its several manifestations. And certainly the Black civil rights struggle in the US can't be understood apart from Christianity. What's the connection of Christianity and shame and the civil rights movement in South Africa? So that's one question, okay? And then we have a question from my colleague here at American University, David Fagelson, who writes, I think your comments about the role of shame in people's decision-making was insightful. Shame seems to be an important force behind recent attempts to ban the 1619 Project, critical race theory, and other attempts to teach about race in America. I think the Florida law explicitly bans teaching that makes white people feel bad about themselves. So sort of shame and its connection to Christianity in South Africa, and shame as an effort to silence Black education, Black history in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's really multifaceted. I think you're asking about religion is really perceptive. I would say that both South Africa and the United States have a kind of, to me, extremely Christian eschatology and substructure in the way we think about politics. Even, I have these arguments with friends of mine who are lefty and completely atheist, and I'd say, you have very Christian ideas about politics and about America being a kind of redemptive project, and that's the goal of politics, and it's to redeem. And they're like, what? But there's something very, very deep beneath these two political projects. The Afrikaners were very Calvinist. More in the 18th and 19th century, they were very, very religious and had real ideas around the predestination, their predestined role as a kind of chosen people, in ways that really overlap with like John Winthrop and some early settlers of the United States and the city on the hill idea. And it's quite fascinating to me how many echoes and resonances there still are, even for those of us who feel we're very distant from, the Pilgrims. But I still think we feel that we need to come to very, solutions that are kind of redeeming and beautiful for everybody, and not temporary and not compromises, but very kind of, idealistic. That's this real texture to the politics in both of those places. And shame, maybe it does relate. There's a line in my book that question made me think of, which is that one of the things, it's one of the places in my book that I mentioned the United States and South Africa, that both places seems to me to have the idea right now that no man should ever have to endure any wounds to his pride. And to me, it's a strange idea, because there are things that we do that are shameful, and that it turns out that way. That is a fact. That's a reality. And I guess to me, it's like,
I mean, pride has to be based in reality, right? It has to be based on something that's prideful, not on your, crazy idea of, right?
I just wonder why we think it's going to destroy people to feel a little bit of shame about something that happened in the history of a nation. I mean, many successful countries like Germany, I think, would say they feel a lot of shame about episodes of their past. Why do we think that, why do we think we're so fragile as a people that to even experience a minute of feeling ashamed is going to kind of hurdle us? It's to me, when I step back from it, it's a strange idea, but it does exist here. It's interesting to me that it shows up in American conservatism, because I remember from some of the conservative ideas that I grew up with, and milieus that were conservative, being told that shame was quite good for people to feel at times, that liberals were bad. They didn't believe in the power of social shaming anymore, around mores like not cheating on your spouse or and so there's been a real shift there that strikes me as utilitarian. I'm not sure. I think the idea is we don't want to feel ashamed of something, which is a particular thing, which is our history on race, which is not great.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a question from an anonymous attendee. I don't know if you can speak to this, but it's a crazy thought. How would white South Africans react to Flannery O'Connor's stories on race? Are you familiar with those?
I read them a long time ago. I think so. I've read a lot of white South African post-apartheid fiction, which has a very apocalyptic, extremist sort of flair to it. There's often a white protagonist who is in some way humiliated, which I had the theory in the book that this is not only a real fear, but a fantasy as well, to kind of be dispossessed and thus released of your guilt. And you don't have to feel bad anymore because all your stuff's been taken from you. Often there'll be a episode of a housebreaking, which will be very, very extreme. I mean, some of these Southern writers like Flannery O'Connor had kind of like a real subtlety and a gentleness to the texture of these very subtle kind of interactions that I don't think white South Africans would find. This is total speculation, but very I think those stories still come from the stance of someone who feels ultimately probably like they have quite a lot of space to maneuver, quite a lot of space to make subtle shifts in the way they see, Black people. South Africa is in a more Faulknerian kind of mode of everything's just gonna get really wild.
Okay, I want to go back to what seems, based on your book, seems an ongoing struggle in the Black soul, if I may, and that is between sort of wanting to be better than the whites, and on the other hand, wanting revenge for all the injustice that's been done. That's something that comes up a lot in your book. And one of the avenues of that is people supporting Chris Hani, who wants a kind of revenge. And they revere Mandela, but in their heart, they're really with Hani.
It's funny. I mean, revenge, I think I see very, very little real desire for revenge here, very little. And I think part of that is particular in that the demographics, there's the feeling of now kind of ownership of the public space, and that maybe you don't feel you have to pursue it. But I think of it sometimes in, even when I've thought about the politics of Israel, which I had to write on once very briefly, but it occurred to me, there's this presumption that the thirsting for revenge that can be expressed by a repressed people, the assumption is that they will then, once they're released from their situation, they will do it. But upon release, they become different, and their feelings can change. But I know what you're talking about. I mean, there's a kind of benchmarking that happens by Black South Africans sometimes to the white, and this is not always, but a lot of people talk to me about this, to the white example. And there's a feeling on the one hand that you want to be better than, you want to act better than them. So you want to not, for instance, punish too harshly white criminals who commit a crime that has a racist, that's like a hate crime. But that might be mild-ish, like, I don't know, punching someone and calling them a slur. And you want to show mercy and understand. You don't want to do what they might have done in your position. And then this other feeling like, can't we just be like them a little and just be kind of normal and like use power? This comes up when policing. So this is also an issue in the United States. Now, the South African police force has a Black chief. It's 80% or more Black. And there's a constant feeling of like, we can't act, we can't kind of manhandle criminal. We can't, do some of the things, torture, mild torture, whatever. Like, we can't act like the apartheid police did. And then sometimes there's this feeling, can't we just rough this person, up, like not wanting, feeling that they have to self-police all the time. And I think that can kind of occasionally have like a bursting out where there can be protests that turn into kind of quite full-on looting moments, and there can be a kind of eruption briefly of just, we don't want to behave. We've been trying so hard to behave such that you won't say, we told you so, they're really badly behaved. But we can we just misbehave for just like a few minutes like you did?
Well, yeah, and being so strict on oneself, allows things to build up that could then erupt instead of just a little,
exactly.
Yeah. We have a question from Sean Gibson, and he asked, has the South African Affirmative Action Program, broad-based Black economic empowerment, brought about real economic and socioeconomic transformation? Has it achieved its objectives? And does it still have a place in South Africa today?
This is another case of really no counterfactual makes it difficult. I think the overwhelming consensus in South Africa is that it was not a success, in part because I think people and South African leaders, they wanted to see Black success very quickly. So what they came into the aftermath of apartheid with was a few Black South Africans who had the resource, who traveled overseas, gotten PhDs, gotten a chance to be properly educated, and then most who were really prevented from getting any kind of skills at all. And so they wanted to show, and I think it wasn't totally unreasonable, but to show very quickly that Black South Africans could be successful. They could do things like run big companies. They could be big farmers. They could be on the, own companies that were on the stock exchange. So the broad-based, the initial, it wasn't broad-based, sorry, it was Black economic empowerment, focused on incorporating mostly overseas educated Black South Africans rapidly into the very top echelons of corporate management. And this really didn't do a lot for most Black people. And it was a case of wanting results too quickly, I think. What they really needed to do was invest in primary education, lower middle levels of management. And so then they tried to make it more, quote, broad-based. My personal feeling, so then they make basically smaller companies in order to get tenders with the government. They do not, it's a myth sometimes perpetuated in America that the South Africa forces white-owned companies to share their profits with Black people. They do not. If you want to do business with the government, they do require that you have some Black ownership and that you have certain types of Black employees, which I think they have the right to do. Now, was this the most effective way to transform the economy, to get Black people economically active? I don't think so. I mean, I think they needed and still need a much more from the ground up primary education, secondary education. There is affirmative action at South African universities, which I think is a very good thing, actually. That's kind of where you start. And I think they are moving toward that, but the affirmative action program was a failure, not because all affirmative action has to conceptually fail, but because it really wasn't, just wasn't well conceptualized. And it ended up making people really angry because it didn't accomplish that much. And people had to share their profits with in some cases, certain Black people who really didn't need it. So they lost some political capital that way.
Okay, we have 7 or 8 minutes left, and I wanted to conclude maybe by asking you about a handful of ways that your various characters try to heal themselves. And I think I've got a list of 5 things here, and and ask you, what you think, of each of these as a way of getting beyond the trauma on both sides. And the first one is self-healing. So you've got a character who eventually does Buddhism and meditation, organic food, and talks about transformation and spiritual growth and cleansing herself. So what do you think of that as a way out for, sort of traumatized people on both sides?
The obvious thing would be to say that it's hokum. This is a woman who became really seriously just felt that she was so disappointed with the capacity of politics to kind of affect the feeling, that life was different, that then she turned more inward and she did meditation and self-healing, self-care. I'm not sure. My ultimate feeling about that was at least she did something to try to change her feelings about the society that she lived in and how she interacted with it.
And she's the one that you describe as the person of all the people you met in South Africa who did the most to try to get beyond her trauma?
So what she did in particular was she did something very fascinating, which she went back and tried to think about, as an activist, she hated white people. She said that very openly. Her activist nickname was Stalin, for her ruthlessness. But she took it out on collaborators, Black collaborators, because she didn't interact with white people in her segregated neighborhood. And she went back to really try to think about the sins that she had committed.
But she made
herself.
some mistakes. She burned down a supermarket thinking that the owner was supporting the whites. It turned out not to be true, and I think she necklaced somebody who turned out to be innocent.
She found out that she had targeted and she had injured and damaged the lives of people who turned out to be innocent. But it was kind of fascinating to me that of people I met, she was really trying to think about her shame and her guilt around her sins under apartheid as a Black woman.
Yeah.
Which was quite striking. So.
Yeah. Okay. So another one is education, and both the Black people in your book and the white people want to have something in their past that they can be proud of. We're back to pride, right? And they want to know, right? And sometimes for both have different sort of problems with ignorance. Some Black people just don't know kind of simple things in the world, and they have to decide, do I ask? It's embarrassing. And some white people don't know about Black experience, and they don't know if they should ask, and because it's embarrassing, and it's not every Black person's job to explain it to them, right? So, but education in some broad-based way, and helping people deal with just the particulars of life.
Extremely important. Just if I have to think of two maybe lessons, I think South Africa is starting to learn that primary education, probably more important to focus on than tertiary. It also had campus protests, what is different, academic curricula with the decline of the academy standards, and really the focus point is much more, it's important, it's primary. And then secondarily, I would say, the curriculum should, people benefited from just a really strong basic curriculum. And also some of these fights over exactly what is taught seem to me a little, if I have to import a lesson from South Africa, it was important busing. Honestly, they did a lot of busing of Black children into white neighborhoods, which was incredibly effective, as it was in the United States, a history that covered up a little bit, but incredibly effective to have diverse schooling environments. It just really helped everybody. It wasn't just like a morally abstract, oh, they should be diverse. It really helped people really understand what freaking country they actually lived in, to be with students from different types of backgrounds.
Okay. Another point related to this is understanding the suffering of others, that people on both sides come in various ways to realize the suffering of others, but don't fully. How does one achieve that?
I think there's a fear that if you aren't really understand the suffering of others, they're either going to demand, or you're somehow going to be required to do something about it.
Yeah. And
so you don't want to really understand it because you don't want to have to do something about it. And I think in the book, you can see a little bit that it matters a lot just to understand it. That itself does a lot, and you're not necessarily going to be, then frog marched to soup kitchens, or I think there were people that I met who learned that just understanding revealed a lot to them about, you know, different ways they wanted to approach politics and think about it, different ways they would, it just did a lot for them. And it did things for the people who felt understood, that really had a realness, you know, beyond just, oh, thank you, I feel understood. It really helped.
Okay. Another thing that comes up is, and I've got two more, and then we go. We just have a few minutes left. But
Okay.
understanding one's own self-sufferings, right? And some of the characters come to realize the way they thought they were acting out of sort of pure motives, and then they come to realize that something else, you know, was causing anger in them, or driving them to act out of, you know, impure motives. And so dealing with that sort of real thing going on underneath.
Yeah, I mean, something I find weird is that a whole lot of us, some will probably have worked in therapy to kind of get beyond what we think is motivating us to what's really motivating us. And yet sometimes we approach politics like we just will call up a bunch, you know, 1,000 people as a pollster and ask them, what is motivating you behind your vote? And then we'll be like, that's it. That's definitely what is motivating them. And it's really, you know, and so I think there's a necessity in going much deeper in the way we think about and write about and think in ourselves, but also in the body politic about what motives really are. And I think that when people who did that in my book did it, they started to feel less perplexed about why other people were acting in ways that appeared to them to be irrational or even evil.
Because they saw that in themselves?
Because they yeah, at times. And they understood, you know, maybe this comes from a fear, maybe this comes from, you know, very real fear that they could have a material economic, you know, decline if this policy happened. And maybe there's something even deeper than that I can understand, you know, because I've had that idea myself in some other context. Yeah.
Okay, and one last thing, and this is, I'm calling it freedom of mind, or the freedom to actually sort of pursue what you want to do. Because some of your characters, and this seemed to, it was sort of like a slogan during the liberation movement, like politics first, you know, no space for love. Like, how could you love somebody in this horrible situation? And so things get kind of like overly politicized, and there's no room for the rest of life. And but some of the people come to, you know, hey, I don't have to fight these battles anymore. I can just sort of be me and look for love, or look for some other thing that I'm looking for, and that's me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which, and I think it's not unrelated to this sort of totalizing Christian sort of underpinnings of the politics, but where people can feel like a political question, a political, you know, let's say in America, like the fight against ascending fascism or autocracy, or the, you know, fight against Trump, or the fight against woke takeover. It's so absorbing that it almost has to be total. It has to be in everything. It has to, you have to think about whether your kid's lunchbox is woke, like everything, you know, does have this, you can't possibly think about going on a date with a Trumper, like, you know, it's all pervasive. And it was certainly under apartheid, and I can understand this, but one of the women that I wrote about, Dipua, was explicitly discouraged from like having crushes as a teen, because it would take her mind and her energy away from the fight for justice. And I think some of the characters really came to this feeling like not everything is actually political, not all parts of life, that in a way you can better deal with politics. Oops. So, we just had a power outage, but I'm still here.
Okay, well,
But,
wrap up.
anyway,
This goes to
speaking
the
of other
efficiency of the
things,
South
but
African government now, yeah.
yeah, we have these. Hang on, we have a battery. We have a light in another room. Anyway, so yeah, I think you're entirely you're right about that. That other parts of life start to have to fill in, and I think that actually helps the political sphere if that's possible.
Yeah. Well, Eve, thank you for helping us think through these complicated political and psychological issues. And I'm going to go do something else now.
Okay. All right. Great.
Thank you
It's
very
great to
much.
be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight.